Linda Killian. Linda is a well-known journalist. She has written for a number of prestigious publications and continues to publish regularly in the press here in Washington. Being a native Oregonian, I always brag about her having worked for the Portland Oregonian at one point in her career. She also is quite an entrepreneur. She has started a graduate communications program for Boston University and now runs not only that, but the entire Boston University Washington Center. Linda, let me turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Ken. Thank you so much for everyone who's here. I want to sort of welcome my students. Could my students just stand up for a second? My journalism and my liberal arts students. Yes, let's give them a hand, yes. We also have some people from Notre Dame here. We're happy that you're here. And we have some BU alums. Are there some BU alums in the house? Thank you very much for coming. I want to thank the Wilson Center, Kent and Elizabeth and everybody at the Wilson Center who helped with this. It certainly wouldn't have been possible without the Wilson Center. And I know Kent has had an incredibly busy week. He was in New York for the start of the UN this week, so he's had a jet-setting week, so we really appreciate you being here. We also really appreciate all of the panelists who are here. It was interesting putting this panel together. It was a challenge, but we're delighted we were able to do it. We have two Democrats with us here at the moment, and we're going to be joined by two Republicans. So we do have balance on the panel. To my left, we have Congressman Jason Altmire, who's currently serving his second term here in the House of Representatives. He represents part of Western Pennsylvania and is, the interesting thing to me, of course, is that he's a new Democrat and a blue dog. So he co-chairs the New Democrat Coalition's Healthcare Task Force. So he is very interested and has been for a long time in healthcare. In reading his bio and in reading some other material, I saw that he was a legislative aide on Capitol Hill and worked on health care, and he was on Bill Clinton's healthcare task force. So his experience with this issue is very extensive. And next to him is Congressman Joe Courtney from Connecticut, who we know well and who my students work with as reporters for the New London Day. He's also in his second term. Both he and Congressman Altmire are members of the House Education and Labor Committee. He, like Congressman Altmire, has had a long history in being concerned about health care. Before coming to Congress, he was in the Connecticut General Assembly, was chairman of its health committee, and worked on a number of health care reforms there. And he pledged when he was elected not to take the congressional health care until all Americans had health care, and he has kept to that promise. And just joining us, of course, is Congressman Shadegg. We're delighted to have you with us. Just a personal note, have known Congressman Shadegg for many years now, ever since he was elected in 1994. And I was working on a book on his freshman class. So watched the 104th Congress with great interest. And I know that the issues that got him elected, smaller government, lower taxes, I know he has a deep commitment to those issues and has remained committed to those issues. And so I know that as it relates to health care, he is concerned about some of those issues. He's on the Energy and Commerce Committee and has also been involved, has his own health care bill that I know he'll talk about. So we're delighted to have all the members. On my right, we have Chuck Brain, who is president of Capitol Hill Strategies and served as Director of Legislative Affairs for President Bill Clinton. And so he was able to watch the Clinton health care effort crash and burn.
Unfold.
So he has a long perspective, and he'll help us with that. Next to him is Jerry Seib, who has been a long time friend of the BU Washington Center and has participated in many panels with us. He's an assistant managing editor and executive Washington editor of the Journal. Very decorated in terms of awards in the journalistic world, author of Pennsylvania Avenue, Profiles in Backroom Power, and he, I know, will bring some interesting perspective. And then, certainly not last, at the end of the panel is Barry Jackson, who served, like Chuck Brain, on the Hill for quite a long time as an aide on the Hill. Was an aide to John Boehner, and then most recently was in the Bush White House. So he will bring that perspective as well. And he is a board member of the Wilson Center. So thank you, all of you, for being here. I know that Congressman Shadegg and Congressman Courtney can only be with us, so I think we'll start with you two first. And I suspect the perspectives will be slightly different. Obviously we hope that we have some light as well as heat here. But I guess I'll start with either of you, Congressman Courtney. What is right about the Democratic proposal? What is necessary about the Democratic proposal? Why is it so important? And how are we going to pay for it?
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to stop by and say hello again. I want to give kudos to your program, your journalism program, which I think is really a great way to, give young journalists a running head start in terms of covering Washington, D.C., and again, it's been a real success in Connecticut. The question is an interesting one. Coming from the state of Connecticut, which, as many of you know, has always been touted as the insurance capital of the world. Woody Allen used to make a lot of jokes about how boring we all are in the state of Connecticut because there is such a high prevalence of companies there. My dad was an insurance defense lawyer growing up in the state, and I lived near the Hartford area. So, I've got it in my DNA. And certainly when you look at the proposal and some of the rhetoric that's out there right now about government takeover and sort of the invasion of the private sector, and coming from a state which I think all of you would probably anticipate would be probably pretty concerned about that type of change, and to see the reality in Connecticut, where again we have newspapers like the Hartford Courant, which cover the insurance industry like a box score. And to see that really the response is not one of panic or consternation. About 4 weeks ago, the Hartford Courant Sunday edition, top of the fold, front page headline was "Insurers Poised to Gain from Healthcare Reform." People who are in the industry and are close to it and are watching the progress of the House bill and the Senate bill understand that a proposal which creates tens of millions of new customers for health insurance is really not a bad thing for an industry that sells health insurance. And the system of subsidies and tax credits, which will make insurance more affordable for individuals and small businesses, at the same time that you are eliminating a lot of the barriers that exist in the insurance market today in terms of pre-existing conditions and rescissions, which, in my opinion, a lot of the more enlightened and thoughtful people in the health insurance industry understand really has to go the way of the horse and buggy in terms of running that type of sector of our economy. Really provides not a gloom and doom scenario, but in fact an opportunity for a healthier and more rational and functional insurance market than the one that exists today. But the trick here is really whether or not this thing is going to be affordable. I mean, every time I get someone from Aetna or Cigna, Connecticut, coming into my office, who I've known for many years from my days working in Hartford, they're all saying, you know what, let's get rid of Pre-X. It's a system that it creates nothing but headaches for us. But you have to broaden the marketplace. You have to widen the purchasing system that's out there, which is what President Obama's plan going back as a candidate for president was talking about from day one with the creation of a purchasing exchange. But the key is that if you're going to broaden that, and it has to be through some form of requirement or mandate, you've got to create a system that's affordable. So for young people who are in this audience, 4 years from now, if a requirement comes in that you have to have insurance, and we've got this purchasing exchange which is offering a menu of choices, the key is whether or not you're going to be able to actually afford it. And to me, that is really the issue which I think from your standpoint, you should be focused on like a laser beam. I believe that providing a public plan as one of the choices for that in that marketplace is a way of making sure that you're going to have actually an affordable health plan, or at least more competition to ensure that that's the case. Again, there are some people in the insurance industry who are freaked out about the notion of a public plan. But frankly, if they can't accept that, and we have a very non-competitive health insurance market that exists today, I mean, we've all been listening to this debate long enough to know that many states have almost, a monopoly situation in terms of what health choices are out there right now, then frankly, the only other way to create that is to repeal McCarran-Ferguson, which I know there are people on the right and the left who actually believe that may be, that's again, the law that provides antitrust protection for the insurance industry. And that's something that would create panic and consternation in the private health insurance sector of America, which again is concentrated to a large degree in a state where I come from. So, I guess I'll stop there. But again, I think the notion that this is going to be the obliteration of the private sector in health insurance is way overhyped out there right now, and the people who are closest to it understand that. The question is whether we're going to strike the right balance in terms of making sure that widening the market and making it more affordable is actually going to work for people.
Congressman Shadegg, I know you are very concerned about affordability, but not only from the perspective of the consumers, but also the government. How is the government going to afford this? And cost. And I know you're also concerned about mandates, and that your bill, I think, stresses competition in the insurance industry.
I'm going to give you all a very, very radically different perspective. And it's going to be probably different than you've heard anywhere else. I wish I could stay and answer questions. Unfortunately, I have an obligation at 9 o'clock. But just take logic and think through what I'm going to say, if you would. First of all, I agree with my colleague that the big insurance industries love this. As a matter of fact, if you're hearing that they don't like it or they're scared by it, they're wrong. And Congressman Courtney told you exactly why. They struck a deal. The deal is that the government has said, we're going to force every American to buy your product, in exchange for which you're going to have guaranteed issue and community rating. That means you're going to stop denying people coverage because of pre-existing conditions. That's a heck of a good deal. We're going to force 40 million, now the numbers come down to 30 million, it was once up to 47 million, new customers to buy the insurance company's product. Of course they love it. I want to begin by just saying the insurance companies and the health industry are not your friends, and they're not my friends. I've been fighting for health care reform since I got here in 1995. Linda and I met when I was in the freshman class, but my biggest battles here have been in the insurance area, health insurance specifically, and on health care. I worked on Patients' Bill of Rights from the day I got here. I fought my own conference on the issue. Quite frankly, I believe government has created a structure that protects the health insurance from competition. And guess what? This bill is going to protect them again. And the reason that costs are out of control, at least in part, is because the health insurance industry does not have to compete. They have essentially two monopolies. They're really in two markets, and they have a monopoly in each created by the government. Let me try to explain this. There are two types of insurance in America. Group insurance, 60% of Americans, it used to be 70%, get their health care through group insurance. All of you that work for the federal government here get group insurance. You get it through FEHBP. But if you got it in the private sector, you'd get group insurance through your employer. The government ensures that those group companies do not have to compete for your business. Very nice deal, and it gets better under Mr. Obama's bill. The second category of insurance, where Mr. Courtney just spoke about and where the president's been talking about, where as many as 95% of the people in one state get their insurance from as few as 5 companies is the individual market. Again, the government is giving those insurance companies essentially a monopoly. Now let me just try to explain that. In the group insurance industry, the government has essentially forbidden you to force the insurance company to compete. Here's how they do it. The government says that only group insurance is tax-free. Only group insurance is tax-free. If you take a plan offered to you by your employer, you're lucky enough to get that, you get it tax-free because the government has said employer-provided group insurance is tax-free. That's a heck of a good deal. In life, you will learn, you're all young, but you're beginning to pay taxes. You've seen the big chunk taken out of your checks. If you can get anything tax-free, go get it. But imagine what that policy does. I think it is the most morally outrageous policy in America. Because what it says is that 2 things. It not only says to the insurance industry they don't have to compete for your business and my business, it says to the poorest people in America, you lose. Tough luck. Pardon me, but screw you. That's what that policy says. Because it's the least well-off in our society who do not have employer-provided care. And we say to them, don't be a burden on society. Don't go to an emergency room for free care. Buy yourself a policy. But here's how much the federal government cares about you getting a policy. We're going to tax you first. We're going to make you pay income tax on the money to buy that policy before you buy it. We're going to smack you down and make you pay at least 1/3 more for that policy. Outrageous, immoral, wrong. This bill does not fix it. But we have that monopoly. Employers can buy health insurance tax-free and give it to you. You can't go buy it tax-free. Now, let's look at some of the things that does. What it really says is people in the health insurance business don't give a frap about you and me. You go home tonight, I guarantee you'll watch a television commercial. You'll watch more than you can stomach from Geico, Allstate, State Farm, Farmers, you name it. I heard a new one this morning, Nationwide. The auto insurance industry is pounding you and me every day with one message. Switch to our auto insurance company and we'll give you better quality at a lower price. When was the last time you heard an ad like that from Blue Cross Blue Shield, United, Cigna, any health insurance company? Answer is never. Never. Because they don't care about you and I as customers. Oh, by the way, once our employer has bought the plan and handed the plan to us, if the plan mistreats us, what's our remedy? We got no remedy. We got no remedy. You can go to your employer, complain, and your employer will say, well, nobody else in the plan is complaining. You know, suck it up. Too bad. In a real market, you and I would be able to pick an insurance plan of our choice that met our individual needs if we're single, our family's needs if we're married, and if it abused us, as lots of health insurance companies do, and my Democrat colleagues like to talk about abuse by insurance companies, you know what? They're right. A lot of insurance companies, health insurance companies, abuse people. You know what you and I do when our auto insurance company abuses us? We fire them. But you can't do that in the health insurance area. That's just outrageous and wrong. So the first reform I would make would be to make it so that every individual in this room can buy health insurance tax-free, just like your employer can. If you like your employer plan, keep it. Great, fine. But if it abuses you, you get to fire it. And you get to buy your own plan tax-free like your employer can do. And then you know what? It's yours. If it abuses you, you can fire it. If you change jobs, you can take it with you. I think that's a no-brainer. What's the other monopoly that they have? The other monopoly, that's all group policy. The other monopoly they have is in the individual market. In the individual market, it's really goofy. We have interstate auto insurance. You buy Geico here or you buy Geico in Arizona. We have interstate banking. You can go to any bank you can think of. Here in Arizona, Wells Fargo, you can buy it in Arizona, you can buy it in Washington, you can buy it anywhere you want. We have interstate banking, we have interstate auto insurance. You know what we don't have? We don't have interstate health insurance. In the health insurance arena, any health insurance company that wants to do business in a given state has to go to that state, write an insurance policy that complies with that state's laws, every dot and tittle, and then try to sell it. You know what that means? As the president has said, in Mississippi, there are 5 insurance companies that sell 75% of the policies. In Alabama, he told us, and he's right, in Alabama, there are 5 insurance companies that sell 95% of the policy. There's no competition. Why is there no competition? Because the government has set the rules making interstate health insurance illegal. Now, why are we doing that? Interstate banking isn't illegal. Interstate auto insurance isn't illegal. Interstate life insurance isn't illegal. Heck, interstate automobiles aren't illegal. Imagine if we set up a structure where if Ford Motor Company wanted to sell a car in Washington, D.C., it had to design the car and comply with Washington, D.C. law, but if it wanted to sell that car in Maryland or Virginia, it had to design the car to comply with Maryland or Virginia law. It's absurd. Government has given health insurance a monopoly, both in the group market. They can't sell to you and me. We can't demand that they sell directly to us because it's tax. We'd be taxed and we'd pay a third more. Nobody's going to do that. And in the individual market, government's created a monopoly for the health insurance industry there. It's crazy and it needs to be fixed. Now let's talk about where there's agreement. There is agreement on two of the three big issues. Republicans believe we ought to create a market to bring down costs. Democrats believe we ought to give government control to bring down costs. But there are two other big issues, and I'll conclude with them. One is pre-existing conditions. Mr. Courtney's right. No American believes that if you're just unlucky enough to have MS or end-stage renal disease or you name it, you should have to pay the cost. If you have MS, the monthly cost for your drugs is between $4,000 and $7,000 a month. Nobody can afford that. So every Republican bill and every Democrat bill solves the problem of pre-existing conditions. There's not a fight there. Let's just pass it. Universal coverage, the Democrats say we need to cover every American. You know what? Republicans say we need to cover every American. You know why we need to cover every American? We already are. Under a law called EMTALA, every American can walk into an emergency room and get care. But that's a dumb place to give them care. Republicans say, let's give them a stipend. Let's give them cash and let them go buy a policy of their own. Let's give them enough cash to buy a decent policy. It might not be gold-plated, but the same amount of cash that we let other Americans have, every American have, to buy health insurance, because we've decided in this country nobody should go out without health insurance. What I just described to you in terms of the private market and competition, letting you buy tax-free, covering every one of the pre-existing condition or chronic illness, and covering every American is in my bill as a Republican. It's in Tom Price's bill as a Republican. It's in Paul Ryan's bill as a Republican. It's in Tom Coburn's bill as a Republican. It's in Richard Burr's bill as a Republican. And it's in Jim DeMint's bill as a Republican. We ought to be able to come to agreement on at least pre-existing conditions and universal coverage.
I want to give both of our Democrats a chance to respond. I would just say, obviously, pretty much everything Congressman Shadegg was talking about was insurance reform. So how about that as a starting point? It seems to me it would have been easy to pass insurance reform, that we could have had a lot of agreement on that. So I'm interested in your response to Congressman Shadegg.
Well, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, if we just ran a bill today that outlawed pre-existing condition practices, I mean, the problem is under the existing market that we have right now, without any sort of mechanism to allow people to buy insurance with those types of rules, you would basically have a resulting adverse selection, and the market would, I think, just shut down. In terms of, well, let me finish, John. Okay? I mean, the fact is today, if there's no guaranteed issue in the individual market. I mean, no company has to write policies. If you show up at their doorstep saying, I want to buy an insurance policy. A woman in Norwich, Connecticut told me a story where she had a heart attack. She's 62 years old, had a heart attack at age 54, had insurance. Husband lost her insurance. They're out trying to buy replacement insurance. He got laid off, and they won't even talk to her because she has a heart condition at age 62. I mean, if we passed a law that basically said you can't use any pre-existing conditions under existing marketplace that is today, you would have that just sweep through the system. So what the president has proposed is a mechanism so that people like that 62-year-old could go into a marketplace. I mean, this is still going to be a market system that he's proposing, but what he's nationalizing it with a national purchasing exchange where a menu of choices would be offered just like the same market that members of Congress through the Federal Employee Health Plan get when they get sworn into office, a nice booklet of choices that they can opt into. And what the president is also saying is that we're also going to help people be able to pay their premiums under that sort of marketplace. I mean, I admire Mr. Shadegg's intellectual honesty about the fact that he thinks that the existing structure right now suppresses a real market, and I think he's right. And the notion, though, that you would create instantly a new array of insurance products out there by just simply repealing these monopolistic laws that were passed many, many years ago, long before any of us got here. I am a skeptic because I think that health plans are not something that you can design like an auto insurance plan, which is basically indemnity type of insurance, as opposed to health insurance products today, which really are networks of providers that you have to construct and require huge capital investment. And that's not something that you can just see happen with the snap of a fingers in the passage of one or two laws.
I want to give Congressman Altmire a chance to weigh in here.
Well, a few things about what we heard, and then Congressman Shattuck can respond as well. We don't hear how you're going to pay for it. I don't. Maybe you want to address that. If you want to make it a non-taxable expense for someone to have individual health insurance, there's a cost to that, and there's certainly a cost to the other proposals that you had in there too. That's a very important component of this. We've said, and I'm sure you would agree, that we can't add 1 penny to the federal deficit in doing this. So if we're going to offer free benefits to people, we're going to have to find a way to offset the cost. So I'd be interested in hearing that. But the idea of the reforms that you talked about, many of which are legitimate, and they're things that we want to do, but as Congressman Courtney said, you can't have the insurance company take all comers, not be able to deny you coverage or drop coverage if you get sick or injured, not be able to exclude you based on pre-existing conditions. And we all agree that that's a policy we should pursue. You should not be able to do any of that stuff. But the only way that works is if you offset the risk by bringing the young and healthy people into the system. Whatever the number that you think is uninsured, 30 million, or whatever we can agree on, the biggest block of the uninsured are young and healthy people who have access to the system but choose not to accept coverage when it's offered to them by their employer. They have access. They choose not to take it. They'd rather spend their money on something other than health care premiums because they figure, well, I'm 24 years old, I'm young, I'm healthy, what do I have to worry about? I'm not going to buy health insurance. The problem with that is you're part of the risk pool whether you like it or not. And if that 24-year-old gets on his motorcycle and drives home and ends up in the emergency room, we pay for it. Now, if you're going to force the insurance companies to take everybody, that's going to raise the rates for everybody else that's in the risk pool. And we were talking about auto insurance and the difference between health insurance and auto insurance. Think about AAA, for example. When you drive, if you don't have AAA and you drive home from this meeting and you get a flat tire, you can call them on your cell phone and say, hey, I got a flat tire. Can you come give me a tow? They'll say, yeah, it's $19.95. Give me your credit card number, sign up for AAA, and then we'll tow you. Well, you can do that if you're AAA. That doesn't affect what any of us pay. But if you wait until you get cancer, until you get that diagnosis that you have Parkinson's, and you show up at the insurance company's door and say, hey, can you cover me now? I'm 55 years old and just got diagnosed with Parkinson's. Guess what? That's going to dramatically increase the rates for all of us. I had a woman in my district come up and talk to me about all the reasons she didn't like health care reform and all the ways she was angry at the Congress for the policies we were pursuing. And she said to me, and don't you dare take my money to pay for those people who don't have health care, because that's their problem. And I've worked hard for everything I've got, she said. And I earned the insurance we have for my family. And I'm comfortable and I'm happy and we deserve what we have. And if those people don't have it, too bad for them. That's not my problem. And what I said to her was, here's why it is your problem. Because as Congressman Shattuck said, the people who don't have insurance, they get treated. They show up at the emergency room and they get covered. They get treated. But the hospital shifts the bill to us, the people who can pay. So we can have a discussion about the moral imperative about covering people who don't have insurance and whether or not we have an obligation as a society. I think that's missing the point. The point is we're already paying for people who don't have insurance in the most inefficient, most costly way at the emergency room. So the only way all of these things work, and this is why health insurance reform has never happened. Every president since Theodore Roosevelt, literally 100 years ago, has talked about health care reform. Congressman Shattuck, I commend you for your leadership on this issue. You're one of the leaders on this, but The Republican Congress was unable to get this done. The Democratic Congress before it, with President Clinton, was unable to get this done. Harry Truman was unable to get it done. Richard Nixon was unable to get it done. And the reason is it's hard. These are complex issues. And you can't just take the easy ones and say, this is what we have 80% agreement on. And there is things we have 80% agreement on. You can't do the insurance reforms without adding people into the risk pool. That's the only way that will work.
I think,
I'll respond briefly.
yes, how are the Republicans going to pay for it?
Let me talk about three things. Number one, with regard to Congressman Courtney's point about what's the mechanism for covering people with pre-existing conditions. Quite frankly, I think at the end of the day, Republicans would vote for guaranteed issue, much though we don't like that. Because we've embraced the concept, I think all Americans embrace the concept that if you're just unfortunate enough to get MS, you shouldn't go broke. What Republicans prefer and have already enacted, I wrote it, we passed it in 3 years ago, was high-risk pools. Under a high-risk pool, every single person that has a high risk and therefore cannot either get insurance at all or can't get insurance at an affordable rate is entitled to go to the high-risk pool and say, I want to be insured. They must then be insured. They must be insured for the pre-existing condition, including everything else. I have an older sister who has breast cancer. She could go there and say, I want insurance. She would get the insurance, and she would get coverage for her breast cancer. She cannot be charged more than 120% of the price that you would charge a healthy person. And that is underwritten by society. The cost of that, the two mechanisms that are talked about are you could have all the insurers in the jurisdiction pay a part of the tab, or all the taxpayers. Quite frankly, we've all agreed that anybody that's just unfortunate to be in that position should be subsidized, and that's what I agree with. So that's the mechanism for doing pre-existing conditions or chronic illnesses. Jason is right that there is a big issue with how do we deal with freeloaders. How do you deal with young people, for example, who make what they think is a rational decision not to get coverage? The proposal on the table right now is mandatory. We go with mandates. Massachusetts has done it. Notwithstanding the fact that Massachusetts has passed a law saying everybody must buy health insurance, in point of fact, roughly 3% of the population of Massachusetts has refused. They just say, no, I'm not going to pay. I actually think President Obama was right on this one. I think when he said, look, if you have someone poor, and that could include a young college student or a young just post-college student who doesn't have the money to buy health insurance, ordering them to buy it and then imposing a fine on them is counterproductive. There's an eloquent quote by President Obama saying that just doesn't make things better. Under my personal bill, what we do is we say, okay, everyone that pays income taxes, you can buy health insurance with your income tax and not send it to the government, up to an X dollar figure. If you don't pay income tax, the poor in America, we're going to give you a stipend. We're going to give you cash. But there's a subset of people, call them street people, or the single mother who's moving from Idaho to Arizona or from Maryland to Virginia when the mailing comes. My answer is we know who those people are, and we put them. We know their Social Security number. We know their name. You put them in a pool, and when they don't sign up, when they go in and ask for coverage because they broke their leg or they came down with a disease, you look at them and say, did you buy a policy? They say, no, I didn't even get the mailing. And you look them up in a database, the government set aside the amount of money to pay for them, and you go ahead and give them the care. So it truly is universal coverage that covers every single American. You ask a valid question about how do you pay for it, and then I want to conclude with what I think is an unfair bias in this bill towards young people. My answer is, you already said it, Jason, about paying for it. We are all paying for the care of the uninsured today. I actually think if you look at DISH, where we spend extra money for hospitals, if you look at cost shifting from hospital emergency rooms to people who are insured, you look at all of the programs that are out there, I suggest we're paying for it now, and I think as a society we would be willing to pay for it. But you have to ask yourself, is it fair to compel people to pay for someone else against their will? Here's my problem. One problem with H.R. 3200, the House bill. The House bill says we're going to have a mandate. We're going to force everybody in America to buy health insurance. It also says that on the issue of age, you can discriminate. That is, you can charge the older person more than the younger person, but only by a factor of 2 to 1. So if they decide to charge me $1,000 for John Shattuck coverage at 59, then this little lady right here, who's 22, can't be charged less than half of that. I got a flash for you. The cost to insure her is a lot less than a half of the cost to insure me. I personally think that all of the incentives in the current system, where we tell people your employer paid for it, gives people the message that it's already paid for and it's free. So I think we're not only over-consuming as individuals, you got doctors over-ordering tests because it's already paid for by the employer and the employer doesn't care, and they're afraid if they don't order the test, they're going to get sued. And I think to say to these young people, you know, you're going to have to pay at least half of what it costs to insure old John Shattuck. If I were on campus right now, I'd be screaming at the president saying, don't you dare compel me to buy insurance and make me pay what will amount to 2 to 3 times what the real cost of my insurance is.
Congressman Cornyn, do you have time?
Yeah, just one quick response.
Congressman, thank you, Congressman Shattuck. Yeah. Congressman Altmire's point about what he heard from the senior citizen, I think, is a real problem for the Democrats with this proposal, and that seniors feel they'll be losing something, and they may, with what's currently considered, at the expense of the uninsured.
Well, actually, I seriously would challenge that assertion. The fact of the matter is that there's certainly a lot of noise out there that has created a fear in people's minds that they are maybe going backwards in this proposal rather than forwards. But if you look at the Medicare system as it exists today, going into negative cash flow 2017, if we do nothing, doctors' fees that are going to be subject to an automatic cut of 20% this year if we do nothing. The fact of the matter is this is a program which is already very shaky financially and at risk in terms of provider participation. The bill that we are moving on in the House would actually fix the doctor's fee situation permanently and actually would strengthen the solvency of Medicare, and we would push out the sort of tipping point by at least 5 years, according to the Center for Medicare Services. We're strengthening the prescription drug benefit, waiving co-payments for preventive and wellness services. So this is actually going to be a better Medicare program than it is today, assuming we get the bill that we're working on to go through. One just quick response to what John said. High-risk pools exist today in many states. Connecticut has a high-risk pool. It's something that we tried to address the issues of people with great illnesses who can't buy insurance in the regular market. That lady I was telling you about, the 62-year-old with a heart condition, she went to Connecticut's high-risk pool to get insurance, and the fee quote that she got for a premium was $30,000 a year. So if you're going to cap her premium at 120% of what's the median in the marketplace there, that is going to result in a huge public expense because you're going to have a stampede of people with serious illnesses going into this pool, and it just goes right back to Jason's question about how do they pay for that type of system. What the purchasing exchange that President Obama has proposed is that you spread that cost out within the marketplace and you don't do it on the taxpayer's dime, which I think is a much better way to finance the cost of changing the rules of the health insurance marketplace. And thank you for letting me
Thank you, Congressman Courtney.
Okay.
We really appreciate you being here. Well, I want to turn to this side of the table briefly, if that's okay. I know that Chuck Brain touched on what Congressman Altmire said about he witnessed the Clinton health plan and he saw the mistake. You know, he saw that the Obama administration tried to avoid some of the mistakes that the Clinton administration made, but made some others of their own. And I know he has some thoughts on that.
Well, thank you, Linda. Thank you very much. And welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here today. And I think the first point I was going to make, which you just saw an example of, is to sort of be colloquial. This is tough stuff. We're talking about 15 or 16% of the GDP, and trillions of dollars sloshing around here. As you've seen from the debate about death panels and things like that, it's exceedingly emotional. We're talking about the care of our parents and grandparents and children in addition to ourselves. So it's incredibly emotional. I just want to sort of quickly point to, and Barry and I were up here sort of joking back and forth that we've seen the you're also witnessing the sort of the staff gene and the member gene. I mean, the members who do have to go, and Jason has served in both functions. Members who have to go back. First of all, they have to make a decision, And ultimately, they have to go over to the House of Representatives, take out the little card, and push it in. And they've got two choices: it's red or green, yes or no, on an amendment. And they have to go home and justify that in town meetings, as we've seen, to constituents, on the street, to businesses in there. So they're incredibly articulate and thoughtful, informed, and feel passionate about what they, positions that they're taking and will have to ultimately defend. The staff gene is sort of more analytical. We don't have to go back to Pittsburgh this weekend and bump into people or answer the phone from our mother or brother, what the hell are you doing? So we can sort of analyze the situation, pose the options, try to avoid pitfalls, try to accommodate them as they work through it. And so in that sort of staff gene, and maybe sort of an experienced staff now, I'm sort of want to just talk about sort of three lessons that I can look back at the Clinton era and sort of point out either made or mistakes that they've learned from or not. The first one I call is a lesson learned, something that they've done right, and that's the issue of timing. The Obama administration came in and said, "Let's go." Let's go from day one. It was clear, last fall at this time, once a number of people sort of could predict what the election result was going to be. We're going to hit the ground running. Let's get planning. Let's get working on the Hill, and let's get this through Congress as soon as we can. A little bump in the road. The presumed, czar of this, the Secretary Tom Daschle, didn't get confirmed. So there's a little bit, but still, let's move quickly. And if you look back, and Jason and I were trying to remember back to the Clinton era at this time, the task force, the Hillary Clinton task force, Ira magazine, a name out of history, was just sort of getting organized at this point, just beginning to get their work groups together to formulate the plan. And fast forward 16 years, we've got a bill that's through 3 House committees in the process of being sort of organized and reconciled. And there could be a bill on the House floor within a month or within a few weeks, we'll see. Through one Senate committee, another working. So the lesson learned of timing is just go as fast as you can and to avoid sort of the impending politics of an election year. A lesson that I would say, a lesson overlearned, is a question of sort of detail. I mentioned the task force and the process that they went through, which I didn't participate in, but it was on the Hill for watching. It was incredibly tortured for looking at it from an outside. And ultimately, they submitted a very detailed plan to the Congress that could be mimicked, with 2,000 pages or whatever it was, 27 new agencies, blah, 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 blah. And so that detailed plan was really easily picked at. Just pick one or two things here that sort of character the whole plan, and then people sort of form an opinion based on the whole plan. I was on the Ways and Means Committee staff at the time, and I sort of want to sort of try to inject a little bit of what I would call historical accuracy here. The Clinton, quote, wisdom, conventional wisdom, telling of the story is that they were told by the Hill to submit a detailed plan, told by the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, whom I happened to work for. And that was, in fact, in one of the biographies, and the fateful, the worst advice we ever got was from Dan Rostenkowski saying, submit a detailed plan. And that was the beginning of the end of it. Those of us who work for the Ways and Means Committee at the time remember it's sort of exactly the opposite. Send us a broad plan, send us an outline, let us work with it. And so it didn't happen, and who knows exactly what's right. I suspect that there's a bully pulpit that's bigger on the sort of send us the detailed plan. So that'll be the way history is written. But the Obama administration, I think, overlearned that. Said, okay, detail. We can't do that. So, okay, let's say we want health reform. let's do health reform. Okay, send us a bill. We want health reform. I think they overlearned it and didn't provide enough specificity. Not 2,000 pages of legislative text, but maybe 40 or 50 pages of a pamphlet that you could really sort of specify that, so that you could sort of find a middle range there and have Congress work off that theme, but they would sort of develop the details a little bit differently. And then I think sort of the if I'm charitable, I'll call it lesson not learned. If you want to be a little, uncharitable, it's sort of mistakes made, and that is not anticipating the end of the process, not anticipating the opposition, and working back from there. We've worked on a few bills. The smartest thing you can do is sort of look out several months and say, who can kill me? Either in terms of organized interest groups, and the administration has done a good job at reaching out to some of the industries. Insurance industry, we talked about being one of them. Insurance industry with their ads, in essence, killed Harry and Louise, killed healthcare reform. Insurance industry is not doing that right now. The pharmaceutical industry is not sort of running those ads. So they anticipated that, but I really don't think they anticipated, and certainly could have, a groundswell of political opposition. And that is, we've made reference to it here, people losing something. As much as we talk about the uninsured, the vast majority of Americans have insurance. We want to gripe about it, but fear losing it, fear having it being too expensive. And even, a larger percentage, approaching over 95% of voters in the last election have health insurance. And they're fearful that they're going to lose something. The mistake made is focusing, leaving that as sort of, not as an afterthought, but sort of as not as the primary focus. Started, responsibly focusing in on the uninsured. How do we cover the uninsured? How much does it cost? Where are we going to get the money, et cetera, et cetera? Leaving folks, Harry and Louise's, kids. They're probably retired, so they're kids. Okay, what does it do for me? And that sort of anxiety, and we've seen it, I think, unexpectedly, in the elderly. The elderly don't really have a dog in this fight. They've got Medicare. It's not going to change dramatically. It is the trust fund is even going to be extended. The future of Medicare will be extended as a result of this bill. But the elderly believe they have a dog in the fight. The elderly are focusing in and telling members of Congress to sort of be careful here. So I think that's the sort of mistake made, is not looking out of the future, saying what interest, and they did a good job of that, but what political dynamics can really hurt, and then say, okay, how are we going to anticipate that? Which would lead you to sort of talk about insurance first. Sort of moving that, you see message-wise, there's a lot more focus in on that, but maybe it's the issue has been defined, and sort of tough to put that that genie back in the bottle. So that's just some lessons I've observed, and we'll pass it on.
Thanks, Chuck. We've been joined by Congressman Burgess, but before I turn to him, I want to give Barry Jackson a chance to respond, having been in the Bush White House, the flip side of what Chuck has said. You've had similar perspectives. I don't know about the seniors not having a dog in this fight. As I understand it, what the Finance Committee is considering so far could tax seniors who earn over $80,000, could have cuts to Medicare Advantage. I'm interested in your perspective.
Actually, it's kind of funny. My staff, Gene, was prepared to defer to Congressman Burgess as soon as he walked in, which I'm happy to do.
I get nervous.
Yeah. Most of what Chuck said as usual, very well thought out, articulate, and not much that I would quibble with on what they did right, what they could have done better. There are some things, and this is the nitty-gritty of the politics of this. Is as the two sides argue past each other on the perception of the fact set, and I come about it on the Medicare side, what Linda was talking about, a little bit different, because I was heavily involved with President Bush and our team putting Medicare Advantage in place and the Part D program to provide prescription drug coverage as part of Medicare to seniors. And one of the difficulties is there's so many different bills, and so to talk about which one is the Democrat bill or which one is the Obama bill becomes hard. But I'll focus on what I know in one of the bills happens with Medicare Advantage, which is one of the fastest growing, most popular programs with seniors because it gives them choice. Every year they can move between insurance companies, they can get the types of coverage they want, or they can revert back to just a basic government kind of policy. What one of the bills does is say we're not going to touch Medicare Advantage. However, nobody new can sign up for it. The companies can't change the coverage as they can do now. Every year they can rewrite the plan to address changes within the dynamics. And we've seen this show before. When Republicans took over the House, it was at that time Medicare Plus Choice, Medicare Plus Choice, which was something Republicans wanted, bring competition into a government monopoly. President Clinton agreed to this, and then the Democrats on the Hill were very, very good at then killing the program by squeezing all the money out of it. And so as members of Congress, and coincidentally it was usually in Republican districts, every year there would be this notice from Humana or Blue Cross or Aetna saying we're going to have to pull out of Congressman Boehner's district because the government's not providing us the subsidy anymore. And so you would have 20,000 seniors all of a sudden who just saw a headline in the newspaper that said, Medicare program cut, withdrawn, closed in this district. And I think that's part of why there's a concern amongst the senior population is a lot of them have seen this movie before. They know how it ended. And a lot of them actually like the reforms that were put into place over the course of the last 8 years, and they don't know what's going to happen. And it gets back to Chuck's point about where maybe the current White House underestimated what the real battle was going to be. I believe after all of these health care fights over the years, most people are perfectly satisfied with their health care. They're happy with it. They may not understand the funding mechanisms, and part of the beast that Congress always has to wrestle with is why are the costs so out of control, because the government keeps picking up more and more of it. The real problem when you do polling and all on health care, and do you want health care reform? Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely. Except when you start talking about what it really means and what the cost is to you, it's a matter of transference. I'm fine. I worry about the guy down the street who may not have it. And it's not so much that he doesn't have it. I'm worried about the impact of him not having it on me. And if I add one thing to what Chuck said about a different approach the White House could have taken to this, is rather than trying to eat the whole elephant in one bite, start off with what the real problem is, which is you've got a very small defined pool of people that are uninsured, some by choice, some because they don't have access, some because they can't afford. So let's start with that problem. And then you build agreement, and then you can build out further and further, and eventually, because that's the way Washington works, they'll eventually get to the point where the government controls everything. But let's start doing it in baby steps rather than trying to do it all at once.
Thanks so much. Congressman Burgess, you're a doctor. You were a doctor for 3 decades. And you're also now, so you've been on both sides of this debate. You're now on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, where I know yesterday you were successful and unsuccessful in offering some amendments to the legislation. Before you came, we had a spirited discussion with Congressman Shattuck and Courtney about the merits of the bill and what Republicans might do to it. And I know you have very strong feelings about medical malpractice and that needs to be addressed.
Medical liability.
Medical liability, excuse me.
Innocent unless proven guilty, right?
Excuse me, yes. Medical liability, sorry. So let me ask you where you think the Democrats went wrong and what you like about the bill and what you would have changed about it.
Well, thank you, and thanks for letting me be here. I guess the first thing I do need to acknowledge, your staff, Gene, is well placed because we're doing the conference report on Ledge Branch today, aren't we? And so the staff salaries are kind of on front and center on the House floor. And that's something staff always needs to remember as we do hold those purse strings on the House side. I was a surrogate for McCain last fall, and obviously I got to know McCain's plan pretty well. Arguably better than he did. In fact, if he'd let me do that last debate, we might have had a different turnout. But he didn't, and so we are where we are. But I also got to know I got to know President Obama's surrogates pretty well, and I got to know their arguments because I had to prepare for them 17 or 20 times last fall. And I will tell you, I was shocked. Well, let me back up a little bit. Just a little less than a year ago, Max Baucus had this big symposium over the Library of Congress, brought in all the stakeholders. We call them stakeholders if they're on our side, special interests if they're on the other. So he brought in all these stakeholders, and they produced a white paper that was really a pretty thoughtful white paper. And I thought, for all the world, this is the legislation. They are reading the tea leaves. Everybody can read the polls. Obviously, my guy's not going to win, and their guy's is. So they're going to have this legislation ready to go shortly after Election Day. I was a little surprised that they didn't, to be perfectly honest, and a little surprised that we got through the holidays without any legislation, and then very surprised that we were cruising up to the inauguration. You have a new president inaugurated with, what was it, a 99% approval rating or something the day he took office, enormous political power at his back. I thought that this thing was a slam dunk. Of course, former Senator Daschle got sidetracked on his way to being HHS secretary, and that may have set them back a little bit in their agenda, but I honestly thought we would see this very early in the year, and now in retrospect, I can look positively brilliant by saying if they had done this in February instead of the stimulus, it would have been signed. It'd be the law of the land today, and we'd all be dealing with the consequences. But they didn't, and they did the stimulus first, and then the omnibus, and then all the other minibuses that came after it. And we did cap and trade first in the summer, and a lot of people went home for their town halls and 4th of July parades on 4th of July, and were startled to find that their constituents were paying attention to what we were doing up here. Can you imagine the nerve of those constituents? But a lot of us walking in our 4th of July parades, and for the record, I voted correctly, according to my district, on cap and trade. I voted against it. But we're marching along in our 4th of July parades somewhere behind the American Legion in front of the Boy Scouts, and you got people on the sidelines, a mom with her kid in tow, and they're yelling, "Next time, read the damn bill!" This is what we found in July. So there was some angst in the Congress as we were tackling these health care bills in our committees. I think it slowed that angst. Certainly was nothing organized, and please don't believe any of the reports that say it's Republican opposition that's slowing this thing down. We do not have the organization, the leadership, or the skill to oppose anything that this president wants to do. Let me just be absolutely clear about that. It is all coming. It is internal dissension that slowed the bill down in July, and as a consequence, we had a bill passed by 3 House committees but not passed on the House floor that was open for discussion in the town halls in August. And a lot of us got an earful during August about these bills. And the bottom line is, and again, I'll stand ready to be corrected by staff, as I always am in my office, but the bottom line is no one trusts us in Congress to do something this big. I think it gets to the point that people are afraid they're going to lose something in the transaction. Congress is famous for being a transactional body. We take something from one group and give it to another. That's how we win elections. You're going to vote for us because we gave you stuff. We hope you'll forgive us for doing that and still vote for us anyway. But that's where we are today as I see the process. Now, it is hard to figure the Senate. I'm still relatively new here. I don't understand how the Senate works. they don't even have a bill to my understanding. So a lot of us are anxious about what's happening over in the Senate. But I would say on the House side, what I saw yesterday in our finish to the markup, the motion to instruct the Rules Committee about the additional amendments we wanted to put on the bill, was that August hadn't changed a darn thing as far as our committee was concerned, and I fully expect the Speaker to bring H.R. 3200 in some way, shape, or form to the floor, and I expect, just like cap and trade, they will find the votes to pass it. What happens on the Senate side then is clearly going to be what writes the history of this bill. From a medical liability standpoint, I think it is a mistake not to have at least included that. You got a 1,096-page bill and not one line in it about what is the central problem for anyone who's practicing medicine today that they will tell you is one of we have two problems. One is medical liability. The costs go up. The cost of defensive medicine drives the cost of health care up. The other problem we have is within the existing public option, if you will, the United States has the largest single-payer government-run health care system in the world in Medicare, Medicaid, VA, Indian Health Service, federal prisons, lump that all together, and about 50 cents out of every healthcare dollar that's spent in this country comes from the federal government. Since we spend 17% of our gross domestic product on healthcare every year, we are, by definition, the largest single-payer system in the world. And how do we deal with the fact that we have cost overruns every year? Well, we don't limit benefits. We don't put it on a budget. We simply ratchet down provider payments. And we do that year in and year out. We always then come in at the last minute and rescue the doctors right before they sweep over the falls. And we did it when on my side was in charge, and I didn't think it was handled well then, and it's not being handled well now. But those two things, liability and the so-called SGR formula, is what just drives practitioners nuts. President Obama, to his credit, trying to marshal all of the, remember their stakeholders when they're on your side, trying to marshal all the stakeholders, did go to the AMA. To his credit, he went to the AMA and listened to the doctors, and the doctors said, please, liability reform, we got to have it. Some states are doing a good job, make it universal. Maryland's in trouble, New Jersey's in trouble, Pennsylvania's in trouble, Texas, shining star of an example of where it's done right. But not a word about liability reform in the bill that was before us. We're going to ask our doctors to be our partners with us in whatever we do, whatever bill is signed by the president before this Congress concludes. And yet at the same time, we're not willing to move 1 inch toward giving them relief on what they have defined as the central, biggest, most important problem that they have. Let me give you just a few practical numbers. In Texas, I left the active practice of medicine at the end of 2002. My liability insurance premium in 1999 for obstetrics and gynecology in the North Texas area was $24,000 a year. In 1999. The day I left practice, it was up to $57,000 a year. Texas passed tort reform with limits on non-economic damages. Still full, whatever economic damages were incurred, those were recoverable, but non-economic damages, the pain and suffering, loss of consortium, when those caps on non-economic damages passed, now, 2008, the liability premiums in Dallas, Texas, and the surrounding market down from $57,000 a year to around $37,000 a year. So a significant savings just in premiums. And, you know, when you talk about a doctor's practice and how it's structured, an expense like that is essentially either a pay cut or a pay increase. That $20,000 savings now translates directly to the bottom line. That's $20,000 a year that otherwise would have been spent in something else. So that now the doctor, you got to pay everybody else first. You got to pay your nurse, your rent, and kickbacks to the hospital. I didn't say that. But you got to pay everything else first, and then the doctor essentially earns whatever's left in the bottom line. So you translate $20,000 to the bottom line for a doctor's practice, and that is significant to them, and they feel that. But the bigger problem is defensive medicine, and this is going to be a harder problem to tackle. It was estimated in 1996 when Dr. McClellan was working on his PhD at Stanford. He did a study on just Medicare, estimating that it's about $35 billion a year in 1996 dollars that were spent on defensive medicine in the Medicare system. Translate that to 10 or 15 years later, expand it to the whole healthcare system in the United States. It is a significant amount of money that's spent on defensive medicine. The president correctly says, when he looks at Texas, well, that didn't change that much about the cost of delivering the care. You're not going to change defensive medicine overnight. I learned that in my residency at Parkland Hospital. It was burned into my soul about having to practice defensive medicine. It was burned into my soul during the years in private practice. You watch your peers who, boy, they didn't order every single test and then they got burned in court. I'm going to order every single test. That learned behavior is going to take a while to undo. Still, the journey of 1,000 miles starts with a first step. And if we're not willing to take that first step with our doctors, who we are asking to be our partners in this endeavor, it's just going to be very, very difficult to ever bend that cost curve. So I probably told you more than you wanted to hear. I think, if I were just to say one thing about the political approach, I think the mistake that was made in this administration was not moving much more quickly in the year when they had the popularity to do it. Congress has never had the popularity to do this. That's what we heard over August. We don't trust you guys to do anything. A big bill like this scares a lot of people. My opinion, for what it's worth, no one's listening to me on my leadership or certainly on the Democratic side, but we would break this down into its component parts, and you heard those identified in the discussion on the other side. Take the poor folks with pre-existing conditions and insurance decisions. That drives people nuts. They hear the stories about someone who paid their premium all their years, and then they get a tough medical diagnosis, and their insurance company goes away, or their insurance is taken away from them by their insurance company. That's offensive to most Americans. They don't want to hear that. They want us to do something to stop that from happening, and I believe we should. That's insurance reform. We can do that without spending $1 trillion. Some of the other things that were brought up, affordability and portability, I'm sure Dr. John Shadegg talked about some of his ideas at great length and great detail. Here they're still clapping for him next door. Those are things we could do right now without busting the bank. My opinion, for what it's worth, is if we picked 3, 5, or 7 things that incrementally we could get done this year, that would show good cause with the American people, and they might believe us then that we could do other things down the road. I do believe, different from the Clinton administration, that this administration will sign something at the end of the day. At some point, they declare victory and sign a bill, and that is the health care reform that we will get. Remember that when Bill Clinton took office, he didn't even break 50% on his first election. Remember Ross Perot down in my home state of Texas got 19% of the vote, and he was angry because he paid for 20. But Bill Clinton didn't get 50% that time, so he did not have the public popularity that President Obama did with whatever it was, 56, 57% of the electorate behind him. So President Obama came to office with a much different political backing than Bill Clinton did. And then the problems that you've heard discussed. I was up here for what was called the National Managed Healthcare Conference in 1994. Their logo said, "We are the common ground in healthcare reform." I remember paying money to go hear Jim Cooper talk about healthcare reform back in those days. But I became engaged when I found out that doctors were actually going to be penalized civilly if they practiced outside the federal system. That scared me to death. I thought that was un-American and wrong, and that was the point. All the other stuff was okay as far as I was concerned as a practicing doctor. Don't bother me with it. Just leave me alone and let me practice medicine. But when they said I would be in trouble if I practiced outside the system, that was a red flag to me that perhaps there was something in this bill I ought to pay attention to. But thank you for your time. I don't know whether I answered your question or not, but I've learned how to filibuster since I got here.
Thank you, Congressman Burgess. Congressman Altmire, there seems certainly to be agreement this morning that if the administration had done this in pieces, they could have done it fairly easily. And they still may be able to do it fairly easily. They don't really need Congressman Burgess's vote to pass this, but they do need yours. And they need people like you, the New Democrats and the Blue Dogs. So where are you at on this?
I voted against this bill when it was in the committee that I serve on, Education and Labor, because I have significant problems. As I talked, we need to do health care reform. Most of the folks on Dr. Burgess's side agree we need to have some health care reform. I think the House bill was flawed in a number of ways. Most importantly, it raised the income tax for the wealthy in order to pay for some of the initiatives, and we can certainly have a long discussion about the tax code in this country and whether or not it should be reformed and what the appropriate taxation levels are, and that's fine to have that discussion. That shouldn't be part of the health care debate. If you want to have a policy argument about what's the best way to generate revenue within the healthcare system, as they're doing on the Senate side with the limitation of a tax deduction on Cadillac plans, high-end plans, that's a legitimate policy discussion as part of healthcare. Just coming up with a dollar amount, we're going to need X amount of money, $500 billion extra dollars, so therefore we're going to raise taxes to a level to get there. To me, that doesn't make any sense. Similarly, the bill was punitive to small business owners who can't afford to offer health care. If you're a small business owner right now and you don't offer health care for your employees, it's not because you're a bad person. It's not because you don't want to. It's because you can't. You don't have the ability to afford it. So how is adding a payroll tax on top of that going to help a small business in the competitive business environment that they're already in? I just thought that was misguided and misplaced. And I don't think the House bill did enough on cost containment. As we talked earlier, that's the whole point of doing health care reform, to bring down the cost of health care for businesses, for families, and for every level of government. Municipal, state, and federal governments are all struggling with health care costs. We're on an unsustainable growth path. And the House bill, in my opinion, did not address those concerns enough for me to be able to vote for it. So if they bring a similar bill to the floor, and I agree with Dr. Burgess, that is likely to happen, they're going to have to do it without my vote because I'm not going to be able to support that approach. But the larger question that you brought up, the piecemeal approach, goes to the conversation that we had with Congressman Shattuck. He outlined a lot of ideas that everybody agrees on that make sense. And I saw the heads nodding like, yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense what he's saying. And the point of what I said during that discussion is there is 80% agreement on a lot of things. But you can't do that by itself because there's some big missing pieces that go along with that. If you want to bring more people into the risk pool, you have to find a way to pay for it. And that was left out of that discussion. So how are we going to come up with the money to pay for the people that we're bringing in? If you're going to do the insurance reforms, as I said, you have to get the young and healthy people in. You have to find a way. And that's a messy policy argument. Do you require people? Do you mandate people to get in? And how do you pay for them? That's the 20% that's missing. And the reason healthcare reform hasn't happened in the 100 years we've been talking about it is because you have to do it all together. You can't just do one without the other. It's all or nothing. And I think the worst possible thing we could do in having this healthcare debate is to pass a bill that makes the system worse. And that is possible. Makes it cost more, gives consumers less choice, harms the providers in a variety of ways. We're capable of doing that. But a very close second would be to do nothing. Because we are on an unsustainable course, especially for the young people in this room. We have to do something to restrain the rate of growth in healthcare costs. And that's what I think the goal has to be.
Thank you. Jerry Saib, you've been very patient over here, and I want to give you a chance to sort of put this all in perspective, kind of playing off what Congressman Altmire said. Orrin Hatch said last night that this what's being considered could wreck the country. So what do you think about that? And you had a poll yesterday in the paper that sort of gauged where people are at, and I know you want to
Sure.
talk about that a little
So
bit.
you've given me the easy job. Put it in perspective and answer the question of whether it will wreck the country or not. I appreciate that. Well, look, yeah, it seemed to me as I thought about talking this morning that I wasn't likely, from my perspective, to add a lot of expertise to this panel, given what the congressmen have talked about and given the expertise of the two guys on my side. So I thought what I might talk about is something I have been following over the year, which is sort of the arc of public opinion on this subject. And interestingly, I think some of the things that I have found and I was going to say reinforce things that have been said on both sides here. I think a lot of this is kind of baked into the cake of political leaders, but I think some of it has also been misunderstood. So let me talk a little bit about the arc of public opinion on this subject and where I think we are right now and what that might say about where we go from here. The first thing I wanted to do was to try to address what I think are two myths about public opinion this year on health care. The first one is that somehow support has slipped during the course of the year. That's actually not what's happened. The number of people who like the idea of President Obama's health care plan. They liked it back in April when there wasn't even an Obama health care plan. It's not that different now. It's actually gone up a little bit. The number of people who say that I support what President Obama is doing on health care has actually increased since the spring, not gone down. What's happened is that the people who didn't know in the spring have moved predominantly toward the I don't think so category. So what's happened isn't that support has slipped, opposition has grown. It's not the same thing, but I think there was a sense in the summer that what was happening was something other than what was really happening. Which leads to the second myth, which was that support collapsed in August for what the Democrats were trying to do. That's really not true either. In fact, the numbers in polling didn't change in August much at all. We're pretty much where we are now versus where we were at the beginning of August. When things started to slip on health care actually was, and this I think Congressman Burgess coincides with what you were saying about cap and trade, it was early in the summer, and I don't think it was because of health care. I think it was because of an increasing concern about spending and deficits and watching the cap and trade bill go through Congress. I think if there was a big mistake made tactically in the House, just based on the way this is played in the public, it was to force House members to cast a tough vote on cap and trade before you got to them and said, now let's move on to something that's even more expensive, which is health care, at a time when the public was starting to get fixed on the idea of $1 trillion a year deficit. That's where you started to see the numbers slip, and I think it had much more to do with an idea of overreach and overspending and less to do with the specifics of health care. And I think health care in many ways was a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator of what was bothering the public over the course of the summer. So that's kind of what I think the arc has been, which just gets us to the question of where are we now. And as Linda said, we have a new poll. We were in the field over the weekend, and we asked obviously a lot of questions about health care. And the sense you get from these numbers is that over the last few weeks, President Obama has started to get control of the debate back after having let it slip away for a couple of months. I mean, the numbers haven't moved dramatically, but they've moved somewhat in the favor of what he's talking about and in favor of the idea of doing something rather than doing nothing. Just as an example, when we ask people, from what you've heard of the Obama health care plan, do you think it's a good idea or a bad idea? It's bad idea 41%, good idea 39%. Not great numbers, but better than they were in August by a few percentage points. So there's a little bit of a move back there. I think the most significant number was when we asked people, do you think it's a better idea to pass the Obama health care plan and make the changes it proposes, or better to keep the current health care system? And on that one, you have better to pass this idea and make some changes, 45%, better to not pass this plan and keep the current system, 39%. So what you're seeing is a lot of doubt, and in many ways growing doubts, but a continuing solid feeling that says, let's do something here because the status quo really doesn't satisfy us. I think when the White House says that's the state of affairs, I think they're right about that. The interesting question to me, and what I'm writing a column about for tomorrow, is inside that aggregate picture, who's really out there yet to be persuaded on this question? And what you see is a couple of really hardened silos of people who have decided they're against doing something on health care this year, and nothing that anybody can say is going to change their mind. That's about 30% of the public that see nothing good to come out of what is being discussed right now in Congress and by the White House. And you have a similar but slightly smaller group, about 22% of the people who say, I'm fine, whatever happens is going to improve the system. So they're for it no matter what it is. So those people, it's about half the country, are locked in to either a yes or a no position. They're not going to change. None of the stuff we've been discussing today is going to affect what they think. That leaves a pretty broad 40 to 50% group in the middle who aren't quite sure still. And within that group, there are about 20% who are really undecided. When they ask them about the Obama health plan, they say, I don't know, or I have no opinion yet. And that's about 20% of the public. And these really are going to be the deciders. These are the persuadable people here. And what's interesting about this group is that to the Obama administration and to Democrats up here, they're still available. I mean, these are people who, when you dig a little deeper, they are inclined to say by a fairly substantial margin, let's do something versus let's do nothing. They want to do something, they just don't know what it is. They're actually slightly in favor of having a public option in the plan as opposed to being opposed to that. And they tend to think that the greater danger is doing too little rather than doing too much. So these are the people who are truly in the middle and truly on the fence, and they actually want to do something this year. They just haven't heard what it is that's going to happen that has either persuaded them or that they can understand well enough to get behind. And that's, I think, an interesting situation, and it suggests why, if Democrats do think that they can't get to the end of the year without doing something this year, there's plenty of room out there to convince enough people, not just here in this building, but across the country, that it's worth doing something. The flip side of looking at that is that, as our Republican pollster reminded us, if after a presidential speech that was on national television to a joint session of Congress and countless other presidential speeches and 5 Sunday talk shows and Letterman and Leno, if these people still aren't convinced, maybe they're not going to get convinced. That's the flip side of looking at it. But I tend to look at these numbers and say, these are not great numbers, but they're enough to say that there's enough public support to get something done here, that if it's essential to the administration and to Democrats in Congress, and I think at the end of the day it probably is, there's room to shoot the gap here and get something done.
Thanks, Jerry. I think at this point we'd like to open it up to questions. I'm sure we've had a very interesting panel with a lot of information provided. So I'm sure the panelists would love to take your questions. So I guess if you have a question, I don't know if we need a mic in this room or not. So Elizabeth has a mic, so if you could just raise your hand, or...
Can I just say one thing?
Yes,
I want to say,
sure. Well,
this speaks directly to Congressman Burgess. One of the interesting things is there is a lot of support for medical liability reform. It's the second most popular element that we tested behind insurance reform. I think the Democrats missed a beat when they didn't include that originally, and I think what President Obama did on that subject is kind of catch-up ball, because I think there's much more popular support for that than I realized anyway. So I just, as a footnote, I wanted to add that. Sorry.
So who's got a question for our panel? We have a question over here. Joe, one of my students.
Joe Martin with Boston University. Can you hear?
Yeah.
Good. This is for Representative Burgess. You voted in 2006 to allow hospitals to refuse treatment to Medicaid patients in non-emergency situations in which they don't have a copay. How would you balance the individual responsibility that people have for their health care with health care for society? If someone was to go into an emergency room with flu-like symptoms that were a non-emergency, they might get refused if they don't have a copay, but that may affect others in society. I wonder how you balance that.
Well, right now, remember, while there's no individual mandate, while there's no employer mandate, there is a provider mandate that I think goes back to 1988 under the EMTALA laws. So for anyone who presents to the emergency room or anyone who presents to my hospital in labor and delivery, the doctor is required within 30 minutes to do an examination, provide stabilization. If they're not able to provide the service that's required, say a neurosurgeon is required, they're required to transfer. That has not changed over time. That has been the law of the land, again, for the last 20 years. Part of the problem with that, and it was done with the best of intentions back in the 1980s to prevent hospitals from just skirting their responsibility and shifting a patient from one facility to another based on ability to pay. So the idea was we'll remove that, the ability to pay as being the rationale for transferring a patient. Unfortunately, the law of unintended consequences has meant that many people have broken the code on that, and they know that if they show up in the emergency room, they're going to get seen and taken care of ostensibly within 30 minutes. Doesn't always work out in practicality because you do have to triage the most people that are most ill come to the front of the line. I think, and I don't remember the specific legislation you're talking about, but I think there was, in the Deaths Reduction Act, there was an attempt to put some cost sharing into emergency room situations, because we do want people to use the emergency rooms for which they were intended. This is nothing new. I mean, I worked as an emergency room doctor back in the 1970s, and I can tell you that people do oftentimes look at the emergency room as the point of first access to the healthcare system, because sometimes they don't know what else to do. But after the passage of EMTALA laws, people do understand that, hey, if I can't pay, then their door is always open. If their light's on, I can go in and I can get care. And it has led to what you hear talked about all the time. That's the most expensive care to access. One of the unfortunate things, we've led people to think that if I don't have insurance, then there's no way I can get health care. in reality, there's lots of low-cost options out there for a person who's uninsured. You can go to a minute clinic. CVS and Walmart both are putting up primary care clinics within their walls of their institutions. There are, in the 1970s, 1980s, virtually no options for someone who needed a relatively minor operation. They would have to access the hospital to do that and incur all of the hospital charges. But now there are ambulatory surgery centers where relatively modest orthopedic, OB-GYN procedures can be done on an outpatient basis, and the facility charge is oftentimes quite modest, oftentimes about 10% of what the hospital charge would be. So we have not encouraged people to think creatively about being involved in their health care and perhaps even being involved in paying for their health care. It is just simply, we're going to take care of it in some way. And again, I think what you're referring to was the Deficit Reduction Act, where we did attempt to have some cost sharing for emergency room visits to get people to think about what was involved. Now, I will also say, just as an aside, I'm not a big fan of cost sharing. That was my side is, but as someone who practiced medicine, typically that cost sharing charge is something that the doctor is just simply going to eat at the front desk because you have no option. But again, remember, we have no option but to see the patient. Certainly other things that drive that are charges of abandonment and just ill will in the community. So if someone comes in and cannot make that $5 or $10 copay as an office visit, and they are already enrolled for prenatal care, for example, in an OB's office, so the doctor will go ahead and see that patient that day. They're not going to let them miss their 28-week appointment for want of a $5 or $10 copay because the risk-reward equation is just vastly balanced in favor of going ahead and seeing the patient. So the copay then, in fact, becomes a tax upon the provider. Patient is pretty much anesthetized to any consequences of that decision, and it's the provider, either the doctor or the hospital, that ends up eating that charge. It's not, in my opinion, that's not an effective way to control costs, but there are a lot of people on my side who do think along those lines, and a lot of the governors too. Remember, we did the Deficit Reduction Act. That was a consensus of the National Governors Association that came to us and said, here are the 7 things that had unanimous agreement in the national government. Not a majority of agreement, but unanimous agreement amongst the 34 or 37 governors who participated in that exercise. So it was Governor Huckabee from Arkansas and Governor Warner, at the time Governor of Virginia, who came to our committee and said, these are the 7 things that we would like for you to do, and cost sharing was one of those.
Thank you. Other questions for our panel? Another one of my students back there.
Alex Gershon, Boston University. This question isn't directed to anybody specifically. Whoever might want to volunteer the answer. So healthcare is estimated at 17% of our GDP, which is a lot higher than other industrialized countries. And firstly, I think a lot of that is because there's not too much emphasis on preventative care. A lot of it is on, going to the emergency room when you're sick instead of going to the doctor your entire life. So how do these bills that are being proposed in the House and currently debated in the Senate deal specifically with preventative care? Is that individual mandates which are going to help people go through? Because as we know, the U.S. isn't the most healthy country in the world. Childhood obesity, type 2 diabetes is a major issue. And so how are things like that? I think a lot of times right now, talk in Capitol Hill is about cost. Well, let's talk about health. Like, how do we make our country healthy?
Well, we have about 5 minutes left. I could give you a half-hour discussion about that issue, which I won't. But I would just say you're exactly right. What you said is a big problem with the trajectory of healthcare costs that we've talked about. We have a reimbursement system that incentivizes you to get sick, because the more often you show up at the doctor's office, the more tests they order and the more procedures they run, somebody's getting paid for that. There's a financial incentive every step of the way. The more times you show up at the office, the more money they're going to make. We want to change the reimbursement system to incentivize quality of care, not quantity of care. You look at the outcomes, and this is easier said than done. This is a much longer discussion. It's not easy to do, but it can be done so that the provider, hospitals as well as physicians, are reimbursed to keep you healthy and keep you out of the system in the first place. Because you're exactly right. We could pay $8 now for you to get a diabetes screening, test your blood sugar, and get you on the proper protocol and treatment regimen to prevent you from getting diabetes in the first place. Or we could wait 15 or 20 years and pay $500,000 for the rest of your life or more to treat diabetes and all the things that happen as your health degenerates as you get older. That makes no sense. We want to make sure that we're going to prevent you from getting diabetes. We're going to cover mammograms and all cancer screenings and diabetes tests and flu shots, things for which we know you're preventing the long-term costs. In the beginning, there will be no cost sharing to that, especially for seniors under Medicare, because Medicare does a terrible job of prevention right now. Medicare is designed to treat illnesses and things that happen, not to keep seniors well. So we want to fundamentally change the reimbursement system to keep people healthy and out of the system. And prevention and wellness is a big part of both the House and the Senate plan.
I've got to go to a hearing on bailing out newspapers here in just a minute. Let me just
Hey, get there. Come on, hurry up.
Are you going to help them out?
Let me just add to that. We had, the Safeway Corporation has come and talked to, I know they've come and talked to our Republican groups. I think they've come and talked to the Democrats about the things they are doing to help encourage their employees to maintain a healthy lifestyle, because they have found this reduces their overall cost for providing health care. And that's a good thing. But we were prevented from offering essentially what was the Safeway amendment in committee because, as it turns out, there's also a regulation in the HIPAA legislation, the Kennedy-Kassebaum legislation from 1996, that prevents greater than a 20% subsidy for healthy behaviors, if you will. So Congress need legislatively to change those HIPAA regulations to allow the Safeway amendment to be part of H.R. 3200. But as it stands right now, we weren't allowed to. I will say this, and I'm a bit of an outlier here too. Fee-for-service type practice gets takes on a lot of baggage in this discussion. But I will tell you, having lived in a world where I was paid for how many patients I saw during the day, not how many procedures I did, but how many patients I saw, versus a system where I was capitated, where it didn't matter how many patients I saw, I was paid the same thing no matter what. You want to create a condition where there's standing room only in the coffee room, go to a capitated clinic. Because it doesn't matter how many patients you see, you've already maxed your earnings for that day before you've seen a single patient, and in fact, you may only diminish your clinic's bottom line by making yourself available to see patients. It is the wrong incentive. Doctors are goal-directed. We don't get into medical school by going through college and saying, yeah, I'm such a good person, they'll let me in at the end of this. No, we were the gunners. We sat on the front row. We asked those obnoxious questions. We were the guys that always busted the curve on the physics exam. That's the way we are. That's the way we're hardwired. And if you create a system that pays people not to see patients, we are going to make our physician manpower shortage only that much worse with creating the wrong incentive. So although I agree that healthy behavior is a good idea, and with the system we have now, we anesthetize people to any consequences to their behavior. We create a system that will not allow a longitudinal relationship between an insurance company and a patient and a doctor, so that they're all in partnership working toward the same goal. But we have to be very, very careful about doing away with what I perceive are the correct signals in a doctor's practice, in that we want you to be working, doctor. If you're not working, then you're not doing what we sent you there to do. But Medicare, I love Medicare Advantage now, but I got to tell you, Medicare Part C, when it showed up on my doorstep in 1997 and no one told me what it was or why it was there, I did wonder how in the world is this HMO thing going to work in Medicare. I saw it as problematic because they told patients which doctor they had to see. And I saw Medicare patients because my mother told me I had to. That I couldn't refuse to see Medicare patients, and so I saw those on the HMO, and I would question the patients. I'd say, you're on this Medicare HMO. They tell you what doctor you have to see, and they'd say, I know, I'm seeing you, aren't I? I'll leave that. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Burgess. Thank you for joining us. I don't know if our panelists have another few minutes. If we could take a couple more questions, is that okay? We have one over here.
Yes, I would like to ask a follow-up question on what my colleague asked. This is sick health reform. It has nothing to do with health. Why don't we talk about putting incentives to physicians and to the community to encourage positive health lifestyles, specifically age, sex appropriate? In England, where I practiced, we changed the payment system whereby doctors were paid bonuses if they had health education. They send letters to their patients on their birthday, according to their age and sex and where they are, the risk factors, and they give them additional information on their lifestyle, but also they encourage them to do tests that are appropriate for their specific age and sex. So why can't we make the payment system work for positive health by focusing on prevention and early intervention? Because currently we're paying a lot of money in the last few days of people's lives, and it has nothing to do with health. It's about death and sickness.
I just want to make, and I was tempted earlier, make one sort of, I'm going to joke about the staff member dichotomy here, sort of a staff observation, the practical difficulties of doing enacting legislation. The problem is that everyone has agreed that this bill has to be paid for. It's not going to increase the deficit, over 10 or 20 years. The official arbiter of the deficit in the federal government's budget, for a standpoint of Congress, is the Congressional Budget Office. Green eye shades across the highway. They're getting pilloried over in the Senate by not working fast enough, but they can only work 24 hours a day. Preventive benefits, which are included in all of the bills, have a frustrating expense analysis. They cost money. If you encourage a doctor to see, you reimburse some prevention right now, you're covering something. The Congressional Budget Office knows exactly, it says that will cost $5 billion next year to make sure we do something more on type 2 diabetes. You say, well, okay, we all know that if we reduce prevalence of type 2 diabetes, we will have less, you as a physician know more than I do, but we will have less of that in the future, which we will, won't have to pay for. So therefore, it is a good thing. We will save money. Let's spend more money now in the short term on prevention, save money in the long term. The problem is that the economists and the budget analysts don't agree with that. They would say you will spend money in the short term, you will not save money in the long term. In fact, you will probably even spend more money. Their analysis is they see money spent on the system never reducing the cost over the long term. So as members get try to do more on prevention, in any bill that gets enacted, we'll have more on prevention. But it doesn't, it just means that there is a bigger deficit in the future that they have to fund in the same bill. So we're increasing taxes or cutting Medicare Advantage or something like that. It's a perverse system. Democrats have to deal with it. The Republicans have to deal with it. We'd like to beat CBO over the head, to tell them, get it right. Don't you understand? Of course we have to save money if we are healthier and spend money on being healthier. But those are simply the rules we have to sort of live with. And it has the perverse incentive of not discouraging us from spending money in ways that we intuitively know we should be.
Do we have another question that we have one in the back over here. I think that's a really good question, and I think it's a slightly scary question. And what price would the Democrats pay for trying to do that?
Well, I'll take a stab at this. I was a House staffer, not a Senate staffer, and so how the Senate thinks that they can do a 50-vote reconciliation process baffles me from this standpoint. If the parliamentarian follows 200-plus years of precedent, to do reconciliation, it has to be either a direct cost or direct savings. And what all this conversation has been about is health insurance reform is the good part of this. If you bring a reconciliation bill, a true reconciliation bill on health care, it's going to be Medicaid cuts, Medicare cuts, and tax increases. And I'm just not really sure how many Democrats are going to rally up and say, oh, yeah, I'm going to vote for, especially a year out with an angry public. Yeah, I was the guy who voted for Medicare cuts and tax increases. Yeah, that was me. So I think there's zero chance that they get this through reconciliation. It's not going to work. Nobody's going to vote for it. That's just my guess.
Well, I think it's unlikely they'll do it with reconciliation. I agree with that. But they did spend some time in the month of August studying exactly how far you could stretch the definition of reconciliation to make sure the parliamentarian didn't say what you just said he would say. And I think they got further than they thought they would. So while I'm sure they don't want to, while I still think it's unlikely they will, I think it's a little more likely than I thought a couple of months ago.
I mean, isn't there something wrong with what the Democrats are trying to do if they have to do it through reconciliation? And I think Congressman Altmire, I think, said this morning the bill as it stands he wouldn't vote for. So that's pretty interesting, I think.
The historical analogy, we talk about lessons learned and going back to FDR and Clinton, the analogy that in this context of how many votes it is going to be on a final package that I think back to is catastrophic health insurance. Now, for most of you in the room, the Clinton administration is history. So this even goes back a little further to the end of the Reagan administration, where there was, with Democrats in control of the Hill, Ronald Reagan in the White House, a huge bipartisan compromise, expanding health insurance, including prescription drug coverage for the elderly. Wonderful signing ceremony. You get out the pictures, and there's Ronald Reagan and probably Tip O'Neill, my old boss, beside a kumbaya moment in the legislative process. Once the reality of that bill and the politics surrounding that law at that point set in, it was repealed in essence before it became active, before it could set in. So, watch out for. We all say let's have a great bipartisan majority, but that isn't the be-all and the end-all. So to try to hew something closer to 50%, 50% plus one, that's. I worry about the politics of that. If the politics of a huge bipartisan majority went sour so quickly, people should be forewarned.
And as a Republican, you may find this surprising, I would have absolutely no problem with the president and the speaker and the leader on the Senate side jamming Republicans, cutting them out of the process. They won. They're in charge, and the rules are the rules, and so if they want to jam something through, more power to them. That's the way the system works. There's risks to that for them, but they're smart people, and they're going to balance out what those risks are. And you do end up, staffers will sit here and we will always be able to figure out what the compromise is. We usually don't have to pay the cost or suffer the consequences of it. It is possible that you just sit there and you gum something to death and you end up with nothing, which then gets everybody even more upset. So if they want to try to do this, from a political standpoint, God bless them. And as a Republican, I'm just going to beat the shit out of them.
Well, maybe that's an interesting note to end on. I really want to thank Barry Jackson, Jerry Seib, Chuck Brain, and the members who joined us, Congressman Altmire, Shadig, Courtney, and Burgess. We really appreciate your time. I think it was a really interesting panel. And thank all of you for coming.